with that. So start off very importantly, especially today with our guest speaker, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing on today, the Dandenong Ranges in Victoria, the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I always like to express my utmost gratitude to the traditional owners for taking such good care of this land, which is so precious to me. And also I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you're all joining from today as well. I also acknowledge that this land was, is and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty has never been ceded. So today, very, very excited to be sharing the space and the conversation with Kayeleen Brown as we talk about Aboriginal women in land use management and women's role in cultural burning. Kayeleen was introduced to me a few months ago by a mutual or connection, Nicole, who's with us today as well, Nicole Hogan. Nicole works at the YWCA in New South Wales, and she's formerly held a very senior role in SES New South Wales, so you might know her from that role. So I was immediately captivated by the stories and the information that Kayeleen was sharing regarding women and cultural burning and the important role that women play. And it's obvious, and it's actually something that I had never considered before. The conversation around Indigenous burning and cultural burning practices has really come to a life of its own after the fires in Australia last summer. And to think that there was a very specific and important role that women play in cultural burning was something that I hadn't thought about it. But as soon as Kayeleen started talking about that, I absolutely realised that that was a bit of a gap and a blind spot for me, and something that I was desperate to know more about. So when I invited her to join the conversation series and when she accepted, I was so excited and so happy to learn more about what she talks about and to share all of that with you as well. I'm very excited. So just to let you know a little bit about the logistics for today, I'm going to introduce Kayeleen, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about her background and her role and some of her wisdom and information. And we'll take about 20 minutes, more or less, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And you're more than welcome to start dropping your questions in the chat box, or you can wait until we get to the Q&A session and you can pop your hand up or indicate to me that you've got a question, and I'll come to you and you can ask your question directly to Kayeleen. For those of you that came along to the last session, what was that? Oh, can you all hear me okay? But so yeah. On that note, last time as we got to the Q&A session, right on cue, my internet dropped out. So I've got a backup plan. If that happens again, Nicole is going to step in and run the facilitation with Kayeleen, and I will become a passive watching observer. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but we've got a good plan just in case that happens again. So here we go. I'll introduce you, Kayeleen, and then I'll invite you to just introduce yourself as well in your most beautiful way. So Kayeleen is a proud Bundjalung and Yuin Koori woman of New South Wales. I hope I said that well. She has been actively involved in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community for over 20 years and was provided with the privilege in 2009 to represent Indigenous Youth at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Affairs in New York. She's worked in senior project and contract management roles for over 10 years in government and not-for-profit sectors, and she's committed to caring for country both personally and professionally, and developing herself and the capacity of her mob to preserve the environment for our future generations. She's a strong advocate for cultural revitalisation through Koori language and practice, and in particular fire and land management. Kayleen's current role is the Northern New South Wales Regional Manager for the YWCA Australia. So Kayeleen, before we go into questions, I'd just like to open it up for you to introduce yourself and say your introductory words.
Thank you. What an introduction. So you can hear me all well? It's a bit, just making sure. Okay, well, before I start, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm here on Yaegl country, Northern New South Wales, and I'm a bit off country. Like Amanda said, my ties come from Northern New South Wales and Southern New South Wales, so that's the Bundjalung country and the Yuin Nation on the south coast. So before I start, I just introduce myself, so Jingawali. And that's how we say hello in Bundjalung. But on my paternal side, on my father's side, which is my sort of cultural aspect of my country, I would say Walawani, Nayaga, Kayeleen, Bundjalung, Bundjalung, Bundjalung and Yuin Koori, and that's assigning my cultural responsibility to country, to place, and also my connection to the animals and plants of that region of the South Coast. So I introduce both sides because I very much actively associate both sides of my bloodlines, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to still practice and connect to my culture in New South Wales, which is sometimes rare and not always afforded to everybody. So, and just like to acknowledge all the elders and women in my life that have shaped and formed me, the women in my household, my children, who still guide and shape me and mould me into a better woman, and all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have been part of that journey with me, but also the non-Indigenous people who are on that journey to committing to a brighter future. So thank you. So that's my introduction. If we want to get in, if anyone had any questions before we start.
Yeah.
But, yep.
I haven't seen any there yet, but if anyone had any questions regarding Kayleen's introduction or the language, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, I'll jump in and ask you a bit about your background. Yeah, so Kayeleen, you're currently working at the YWCA, and I'm really keen to know a little bit more about your role and your interests and passion around land management and women, and particularly how you're able to play that out at the YWCA.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm the regional manager in Northern New South Wales. So YWCA is a feminist organisation, so advocating for the rights and equality of women in all spaces, empowering leadership, excellence and innovation. So we really work actively in community to build up community resilience. Obviously land management just goes hand in hand in some of that space. Being an Aboriginal woman, obviously that connection to country, the personal responsibility is something that I take quite seriously. And as an organisation, it's something that really mirrors and reflects those values for me spiritually and personally. So I see it as something that I appreciate, but I also genuinely enjoy the work that I do, because I can live the life that I want to live, and I find that the work is rewarding, being able to work at the grassroots with community, but also empowering the Aboriginal community and non-Indigenous community to be independent, make informed decisions and build that capacity.
So how have you been able to merge your interest and passion and knowledge and wisdom in land management from a cultural perspective into your role at YWCA?
Yep, so at the moment we're working with New South Wales TAFE around land conservation, land management. What we're finding is that there are a range of jobs that are available within the sector that are opened up, but the entry level to those jobs are quite hard for a community to get into, but also the initial concept to getting access to that interest is very hard at times. So we've developed a package with the TAFE, which is an entry level unit that's being delivered in Northern New South Wales at Gunnellabar. So it's a land conservation, but it's open to community to come in with families and the youth to develop employability skills. So they're going to learn how to do some landscaping. We're going to reintroduce native species on site. Later there is plans that the TAFE would help coordinate some traditional burns or cultural burns with community. We have a strong Aboriginal community organisations in the region, so the Bundjalung Tribal Society. There is a Aboriginal advisory group within the council, obviously the Aboriginal land councils and traditional owner groups. So whilst we're not necessarily leading the space, we're just facilitating the opportunity for those discussions to occur and creating more soft entry points for community to build those skills, and in a supportive framework where, unfortunately for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, sometimes the education sector is daunting and they have been disengaged.
Yeah. So how long has that program been running for?
We've just developed it, so it took some time to get through the process of drawing back some of the paperwork. So we've really reduced it so that they don't have to do lengthy assessments through paperwork or have access to home computers. And it's going to probably be first that we're doing in the region, actually. That's testing and trialling that. So that's led by Aboriginal workers within the TAFE, and one of the community leaders who's done land conservation for over 30 years.
Okay, so this is something that I mentioned in the introduction, but the role of women in land management, and particularly in cultural and Indigenous burning, that was really insightful for me. And I'd really just love for you to talk openly about growing up, what that meant to you, and how what conversations you have now, and what you can perhaps share in your background in this really interesting topic with people that have joined today. I'm really keen for you to just tell us where is it up to? Where did it come from? What are we doing about this? Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's a big one, so hopefully we can just touch on it today. As we know, the sector is predominantly male dominant in a lot of spaces, especially in decision-making spaces. So Aboriginal women, unfortunately, fall by the wayside when those discussions are happening. We know that historically Aboriginal women have always had a role. I know growing up, my mother comes from a really remote Aboriginal community, and they grew up doing burns with their hands and burning grass with their hands, and traditionally being able to hold that cool fire, which is what is referred to as cultural burns. Over the years, with the way society progressed and things, we started to bubble wrap fire and protect fire, even with the way that we educate our children around fire. And that's been reflective in the fires recently, where people felt disempowered, people didn't understand fire behaviour, and were not sure when to evacuate or how to evacuate. So women have always had a role. One thing that I'd like to highlight is that there's always been women's country and men's country, and there's also been always matriarchal and patriarchal systems. So those things have always existed, even down to the way that we interact with animals. In our traditional languages, there's always been names for female versions of the animal and male, and there's a reason for that, or the way the relationships that would work. I think also that women, as first caregivers, we're also the creators, and the universe picked us for an important job to, give life. And I think sometimes our role as women generally is undervalued. And I think particularly going forward into this space where we all agree that country is very sick, and I think that women have a really key role in leading that space and really massaging it, because, I might be a little bit biased, but I think women can nurture in a way that men can't, not to disregard the role that men have, but we definitely can come to a place, especially when women come together, we can really have those frank conversations, and especially when our children and next generations at the forefront, we can get a lot more done, I feel. So yeah, generally Aboriginal women have always been part of that. It's always embedded in our language. My old grandmother's still alive. They still sing out in language when they go out into country. We will always have to speak our language for protection. Into lands, we have to seek permission. So there's a whole process that's embedded in the landscape, but it's also embedded in our language. It's embedded in our culture. And I think sometimes in Western society, we've learned to separate those things. And that's why we're having the dysfunction that we're having.
I have so many questions around some of the things that you've raised then, but I'm going to pause at the moment and actually open it up to the floor, because you've introduced a really interesting topic, and for some people, I'm just going to stand up, I'm getting excited. For some people, it might have been the first time that they've thought about this concept, that potentially the way women approach cool burning is different, or there are different roles and responsibilities. So has anyone got a question that they would like to, or a comment they'd like to raise with Kayeleen now? I'm not seeing any. I'll just check.
I've got a question, Amanda.
Oh, please go ahead, Margaret.
I'm really interested in this notion of women's role in burning, because you're absolutely right, Kayeleen. I haven't heard of it before. I hear about the guys and what they're doing. I'm interested to know if there are any differences between the way women do burning and the way men do burning. Different places, different styles, different techniques, different times. I have no idea, I'm making it up, but I'm really interested to know if there are any differences.
Perfect. That was my question too, Margaret, so spot on.
Yes, definitely. But I do need to put a placeholder that I only speak on behalf of my bloodline. And even if you had a bunch of, a group of Aboriginal people, we only have one page of a book, and that's the way the makeup of our systems was always created. So there wasn't a dominator in a space, and those roles were really specific to specific areas. So yes, it's definitely different areas for different places. Obviously for women, we would have particular birthing places and areas that we would use specifically for women's business that was predominantly would be, the bigger areas. Unfortunately, over time, those things have been stripped away or access. Obviously, legislation within different states and jurisdictions has restricted that, and the loops to get through to be able to, do a prescribed burn is quite difficult for women. But yes, there's definitely particular plants and species that we would use in the lead up to childbirth and then afterwards as well. So you can just imagine the importance of those things, and even the collecting of particular plants and things was only done by particular people and particular relationships. And you could just imagine when those things are carelessly burnt or not, protocols aren't being followed, that can be quite traumatizing for some Aboriginal families and communities that feel like the homelands or those special places might not be pinpointed on a map as well. They might be hidden in some bushland that's not known, and that's for particular reasons that they feel like they need to protect it. But yeah, it's definitely something, and it's well known. Like if you had to approach an Aboriginal man and ask them about women's country, they should know that there's places. So I think it's just that it's a bit taboo and it's not at the forefront of people's minds. But if you did have that, conversation, like, oh yeah, women's country is that way, I'm not allowed to go over there, or they could actually identify it quite clearly.
Is there anyone else who would like to jump in? Okay, so I hope I didn't cut anyone off then. Kayeleen, the Royal Commission has been meeting these last couple of months, and as I mentioned before, Indigenous burning and cultural burning has been a topic that has had a raised profile in Australia because of some conversations that were had before the Black Summer fires of 2019 and 20, and continue to gain momentum, I believe, in conversations around caring for land, climate change, and also increasing severity of bushfires in Australia. Have you had any role to play, or has the conversation around women's role in Indigenous burning come up at the Royal Commission, and how did that go?
Well, luckily, I have my cousin here on the line, Vanessa Kavanagh, who's actually doing her PhD in Aboriginal women's role in biomanagement. And she presented a paper and actually was part of that panel that presented in the Indigenous land burning. So it has been discussed. It's obviously been at the forefront of communities' minds, before even the whole lead up. There's been strong advocacy. I think it's great that it's actually being taken seriously, but it's not something that there's been communities that have been striving for this for over, since millennia, really, to have access. And they've been doing their traditional burns in little pockets, but they haven't been able to access some of the bigger places that they would normally be able to access. So, you know, there is that good 250 years that where people were disempowered, where we weren't able to practice our culture, we were refrained from having the tools and access. And that's where non-Indigenous people come in, and the women that live on the land and who have had access to freehold titles as well. So, you know, they've been living on the land, they know the weeds and the plants that have been migrated to this country as well. So I think there's a real partnership there to be able to talk about how are we going to care for this country, how are we going to move forward, how are we going to get this back to where it needs to be, because I think we all agree that the way that this country is going with our land management is not where we all want to see the future.
So do you feel like there's been a bit of a shift or a pendulum swing towards having more open and proactive conversations around cultural burning? Do you feel like there has been a shift in the sentiment, or do you feel like you've been here before and as soon as the dust settles we'll be back to the practices, non-Indigenous burning practices? Have you got a sense that something's changed?
I hope so. I hope it's changing. There's definitely, people are taking it more seriously. I think we've got to make sure that we progress the concept and we start having those conversations and start taking it home. Like, advocacy starts in the home. You've got to be an advocate in all aspects of your life, and starting those conversations and demanding that be part of the conversation in any platform that you're in. Obviously, Aboriginal women significantly are underrepresented, whether it's in the actual decision-making process or even on the grassroots, on the ground. Traditional owners and knowledge holders aren't necessarily engaged in the process, and they're the ones that really have the insight, knowledge and the historic knowledge of the land management before the introduction of these invasive species and invasive weeds. So that, you know, they need to be part of that discussion because they have knowledge that they might not have disclosed, and for whatever reason that's fine, but we also need to be mindful that we protect their intellectual property and their culture and their you know, the stories that they've been handed down, and just create that space for them to be involved and feel culturally safe to be in that space with non-Indigenous people.
So something you and I have spoken about before, Kayeleen, is the sometimes nervousness and discomfort that non-Indigenous Australians and others feel in having a conversation with an Indigenous woman, for example, and asking questions. So Margaret piped up and said, look, I'm clueless about this, and I was the same. And, you know, we always feel like apologising for asking the question because we assume that we should know better, but the reality is we don't. And you and I have talked about sometimes people would love to hear from you, but will be too scared to ask the wrong question or say the wrong word. What do you say to everyone on this conversation today around approaching you or someone that's involved in cultural burning, and how to have a really good conversation without being too scared for getting it wrong?
That's a big question. No, I think it's just starting the dialogue. I think you've got to, you know, you can be an advocate without being a beneficiary. So I think, you know, you're well within your means to be an advocate. Start making those personal commitments around your own personal journey and personal learning. You know, read books, research, get out in community, have those discussions, be involved. And along the way, you know, Aboriginal people will see you showing that commitment, will, you know, see your sincerity and want to engage with you. A lot of the communication within community is through body language. So whilst they might not be communicating with you, they're observing you, and they're watching, and they're looking for humility, and they're looking for, you know, who you are as an individual. And, you know, in our cultural ways or old ways, we have, you know, very strong cultural beliefs around, you know, your spirit, your mandawal, and, you know, being able to look within your spirit and see who you are for who you are. So, you know, for example, I could go out country with my grandmother and sit with her for a whole day and not talk, and she's teaching me a lesson. So I think sometimes we get caught up in advocating for our timelines And obviously the universe is saying slow down, and we need to be mindful that the land, the sea, the animals, they have their own journey and they have their own needs. And I think we need to start respecting their cycles of life so that we can bring that back, because, you know, our old ways we would listen to the winds. We have, you know, the winds, and there's different elements that have cultural significance, not just to Aboriginal culture, but internationally. You know, different international cultures have different beliefs around elements and how they would signal different things for the plants to grow, to signify when you could go hunting, to when you could burn, to when you could go diving, and when you would find particular species at their ripest. We would never take things when they weren't ripe. I think we've just come into the world now where we just are so used to instant gratification. So we're just taking. So not to go on a cultural soapbox, but it's just something that I think that we could really look to realign if we can get 5 practices right.
Feel free to jump on a cultural soapbox anytime, because once again, I'm mesmerised and absolutely fascinated in how you talk and the things you talk about. And you started talking about the spirit, and particularly women's spirit, and I immediately looked on the screen to Isaiah because I knew you'd be nodding, and you were straight away. So Isaiah is a Māori man, and he and I talk a lot about women and women's voice and women's spirit. And he shared a beautiful comment to you, Kayeleen, in the chat box, which I'll copy and send to you if you haven't got a chance to read it. And it's so beautiful that our Indigenous cultures are so strong on the spirit and the land, and that we do have so much to learn. And I'm really hoping that through all the bits and pieces that we're bumping through at the moment, that we do have an opportunity to stop and reflect and pause and reconnect to each other, importantly, but also to the land, and appreciate how much we need it and rely on it when it's taken away. So maybe some learnings. And actually, when you were talking, it reminded me of a conversation we had before as well regarding the role of women in the early years of all children, in terms of the nurturing of children, but also in terms of the knowledge and wisdom. So boy children and girl children are brought up in the early years by women, and so there's a certain knowledge and wisdom that the women can pass on to children. And how much of caring for land do you think, speaking on behalf of your family and your ancestors, how much of a role do women have to play for all children in passing on that importance of caring for land?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the stories that have been handed down to me or told to me around, you know, the women taking the children, walking, teaching them the history predominantly of the water and connection of ways and animals and plants. And, you know, some of them would be through song. So when they travel through country, they would sing particular songs. And then, you know, kids would enjoy it, but it was actually them singing out to their ancestors to warn them so that they knew that they were coming through and that those children come from that country. And so they would always talk about different places and things that they would do, but children would be always with each other as well. There would always be a group of women. So it wasn't just one woman's role to raise those children. It would be a collective voice and a collective role, so that those children were always supported and always had someone there to support them. And then the pressure that sometimes is in society now for women to raise their children and be the carer and be, you know, on the clock 24/7, they didn't have those pressures, because whoever was the best suited to support that child at that point in time stepped in, because like all of us, we have certain skill sets and strengths, and, you know, you might have somebody that's better at making the fire, or someone that's better at, you know, helping with wounds, or somebody else that's better at, you know, doing whatever. They would be able to allocate those roles and responsibilities. But that's where our kinship systems come through too, because when there was those responsibilities, it was already allocated within your birthright and within the system that you were born into. So throughout your growth and the moulding of who you became, you were well aware of the parameters of how you needed to operate, but also your responsibility to others.
So before this call, I know that you reached out to some of your relatives and had a chat with them about the conversation we were having. What do they think about? What do they think about you sharing this information, and what do they get excited about the fact that, you know, you've got this really key role in bringing us along with you on the things that you care about, and passing on some of that knowledge to us as well, so that we become supporters and advocates and pay more attention to caring for land? What do they think about this conversation?
Oh yeah, definitely. They're so excited. Excited in the way that they feel like there's, you know, so many communities, so many people feel like they're ready, but they're just not getting to the table, or they're just not getting that door, or they don't know how to navigate the system, or they aren't afforded the opportunity. And I think sometimes in the way that we develop things, we develop things and get so far down the track, and then we consult at the end, where we know we really need Indigenous people at the table from the get-go in the design, and Aboriginal women need to have a place at that table, because this, you know, continent has women's places, and we know that the practices of Aboriginal people are the best practices for this continent. So I think we need to pay respect to that, and the way that we embed that in the way that we work. And I think the way that we can start to do that is creating space for that, and creating, you know, and even if you don't have the capacity, or you don't have the insight to having to know who it is, just create that space and reach out, and we can navigate through the system to be able to identify the traditional owners or the right people to come to the table. I think that's the greatest challenge that we have, is that sometimes we aren't humble enough as well to actually realise and accept that we might not be the best messenger, or we're not the right person to be taking up that space.
So I love a good call to action. If there are people on this conversation now who are really fascinated by the concepts that you're talking about, and the fact that there's a huge bunch of us who want to help, want to be involved, want to know more, what can we do? Like, after we get off the conversation tonight, have you got any ideas about how we as individuals can go about in our personal and professional lives to start the conversation, or start the advocacy about all the things that you've talked about, the important role of women and engaging Indigenous knowledge early on in conversations? Have you got any thoughts or things that we might be able to start with?
Yeah. So first, I'd just say, just take a moment to reflect. We talk about, you know, right fire for right country, but we need to talk about right people for right country, and respect that there has been systems, matriarchal systems, that have existed. And I think we need to sort of acknowledge that space, and bring that into the home in the discussions that I mentioned. You know, introduce your children to the concept that there's always been roles and responsibilities for male and female, and start that interest through the dialogue. There's a whole range of resources, and I've given Nicole a few dot points that she can chuck in the chat box for people to reach out and have a look. Like I mentioned, my cousin Vanessa Kavanagh is doing some work in her PhD, so welcome for people to reach out to her, but also YWCA, if people are interested in exploring that conversation and facilitating that with non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, we're more than welcome to reach out to us and help us, you know, advocate for this space, because one thing's for sure, I can't do it alone. And, you know, it's not just falling on the heads of non-Indigenous women, but it's also our men also, because you know, we need to have that power balance, but we also need to have that, you know, like I said, right country, right fire, but right people and right systems. So the more that we can advocate for that, the better outcomes that we're gonna achieve. And I just really wanted to highlight, I know sometimes when we talk about Indigenous systems and cultural concepts, that sometimes it can feel for non-Indigenous people disempowered, or even people that feel like, oh, well, where do I fit in, or how do I fit if, you know, we're really advocating for this Indigenous space. But I just wanted to reiterate that our kinship systems have always incorporated non-Indigenous people from other countries. So, you know, people coming into our space, they've always been able to be part of that system. So when you would join that system, you'd be allocated one of those functions within that kinship system, and you would be appointed with that role and responsibility as well. So, you know, we have been working not, you know, with people from other countries or other continents since time immemorial. This isn't something new for us. And that's historically starting to come, you know, through the ages now, with Western science catching up to traditional science. But I just wanted to just reinforce that don't feel that you can't be part of this journey, that you can't be an advocate, because we need you more than ever to be part of that discussion and to advocate for us, because we're only 2 to 3% of the population, and we know in emergency management that the fires are coming back, the floods are coming back. You know, the rainfall is not going to be what we want it to be, and we need to start doing something, because if we don't, we're going to not have some really good outcomes in the next 10 years.
So I think that's a great opportunity for me to stop for a moment again and to open up again to the floor to see if there are any questions coming out of this really fabulous conversation, which I'm really loving. Would somebody like to speak with Kayeleen?
Hi, my name is Robin. I'm on Gadigal land. Also, thank you very much for sharing all your insights and your knowledge. I agree with so much of what you're saying, especially around respecting not only other people's, but the land and other animals' timelines, and that things aren't always homogenous and the same, and everything works with the greatest things come from diversity and having a lot of different ideas. I think one thing that I've always struggled with learning about Indigenous history and lots of history is that what we're reading is not really accurate. And that's not even with the internet. Like the history books I was reading at high school about Australian history were completely whitewashed and turned out to be, they got taken off the shelves about 10 years later. It would be great to have an idea of how we go around getting resources where we can learn from the Indigenous community, the history, and have a more accurate perspective of things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you know, unfortunately, the sad thing is that's what our Aboriginal people were taught to. And it's only sort of come to light over the last couple of years where the true stories are being told to our own people. So, you know, with the forced removal of children as well, and stolen generation, we've had predominantly a large portion of our communities that haven't had the opportunity to know the real history of their people, but also their culture and their history and their responsibility. So I think it's also important to give them some space and some time to catch up for the impacts of colonisation, because they need time to flourish in their culture and aspects. But I do take your note around resources. So what I'm starting to see with traditional owners and knowledge holders that I know of, and like I said, I don't speak for everyone, but they're really pushing away from books. They're actually wanting genuine people to be engaged in community. So particularly where in northern New South Wales, though they're not developing paper-based resources, they're inviting people out to country, and that you're not allowed to record it. You actually have to sincerely commit to that learning journey. And I think that that's a genuine show of humility and connection to the spiritual journey that you would embark on. So I think it's just trying to look at and challenge our ways of thinking and how we could engage and learn their true history. So we're doing some work in the Northern Rivers as well around truth telling and telling the true stories of massacres within our region. So there are different communities that are open to having those discussions. I think it's just getting in contact with them and being able to support them, because they are really keen to have that discussion, but they don't have the resources or means or the education to be able to record it properly as well. So, you know, if you do get that opportunity to link out or identify yourself as someone that's able to help with that, I'm sure there'd be community that would be really eager to link in with you.
Oh, thank you so much. Really great advice. Especially around like knowing that you might want to learn something, but people are going through pain, and being respectful. Like, you want to ask questions and learn, but also to be really respectful that people might also be going through their own trauma, and to give them that space as well. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and there's definitely there's a lot of dialogue now around repatriation from museums and artifacts. We're still in the process of getting our loved ones from museums that have been, you know, taken overseas in the early 19 to late 1800s. So there's still a repatriation process to get, you know, not just artifacts, but our actual people, and the healing that comes from that. And that's not just, you know, being able to practice that culture and bring those instruments that were taken, and being able to, as a community, reenact and redevelop some of those resources and traditional tools that was taken away from those communities. But also repatriation of plants and animals as well. I think sometimes when those things are dug up and moved on, we don't think about repatriating them and moving them to a place so that they can continue to grow. We sort of just chunk them in a skip, particularly when building roads. It's a big issue that I have, and always having a debate about around how do we, yes, we have, you know, economic development, we do have infrastructure that needs to be built, but how are we thinking about the next generation and the next generation of this plant species, and where does that have the space? If it can't be here, let's make sure that there's space for it somewhere else.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kayeleen and Robin. We do have a question that Tammy has asked, and I'll ask it on your behalf, Tammy. I'll read it out, but if you want to jump in and add anything, feel free. So Tammy says, me and my daughter are very passionate about getting the real history out to the community, and are strong advocates for our local First Nations people, but we are finding it hard to get local older generations to talk. Do you have any ideas about how we can assist in doing this?
That's a big one. Okay, so there will be a range of, I'm not sure whereabouts she's based. Do you know what state she's in? Oh, okay, yep. So there are local Aboriginal groups, so you could liaise with your New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. They're pretty much based everywhere. There's also the New South Wales Aboriginal Education Consultative Group, so they're established within the state, who work with traditional owners and community around education resources. They also host cultural nests now that develop and deliver language programs. So they normally are host to some of those knowledge holders that we relate to. There are also key stakeholders within Australia that provide advice on different things. But it depends what you're really looking for. But I would start with the New South Wales Land Council as a point of call, and then your state Aboriginal Education Consultative Group. I can find more information and send that on to you. You can get in contact with them, and then they have local committees that you can get in contact with. They develop local resources around embedding Aboriginal perspectives into the curriculum. So they might have access to resources and tools that the community are developing. One thing's for sure is that not one Aboriginal person knows everything, so just make sure that you just keep researching a couple of resources and different people, because once you talk to by the time you get to the fifth person, you'll probably get the right person.
That's great advice, thank you. And yeah, Tammy is really looking forward to you sharing some of that information as well. Do we have somebody else who wants to jump in and ask a question or make a comment? Because Nicole, I do want to throw to you, and I've still got a couple lined up as well. But Nicole, if I can just throw to you for a moment, you've been putting quite a bit of information in the chat box around ways that people can have a conversation and approach. Have you got anything you wanted to add to what you've been sharing in the chat box?
Sorry, just unmuting. Well, my job was really easy because we had pre-planned and pre-prepared those dot points in that particular space, and also probably a shout out to Vanessa who contributed to that as well. So I suppose one of the topics that we have previously discussed, Kayeleen and I, is in regards to traditional owners of land and speaking with the importance of speaking with traditional owners of land and not just looking at one Aboriginal person as the person who can actually talk on behalf of all lands within Australia. So I suppose to expand on that a little bit further, Kayeleen, can you just give a little bit of more information in regards to traditional owners and the importance of working with traditional owners and permissions and working with elders and so forth?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I just need to be very clear. Different nations or countries, how we describe them, the tribes within Australia have different protocols and systems. So you know, a lot of people now use First Nations as a description. Some people say traditional owners. Some people say custodians. I know in different areas they would refer to traditional owner as their patriarchal system and custodian as their matriarchal system. The way to, in a short, you know, because this is such a short seminar to cover it off, is particular bloodlines will speak for particular countries. So our marriage law, our old traditional ways of keeping tribe peace was that you would follow a particular bloodline. So you would follow your mother's bloodline or your father's bloodline, depending on the cultural dynamics of your tribe or your nation that you come from. So how that works is that if, but depending on which line that you fall on and your kinship system, you might have speaking rights on, so for instance, I'll use me, I have speaking rights on my father's bloodline. So I would be a traditional owner, so I can make those cultural authority decisions. On my mother's bloodline, I don't. I'm a custodian, and my job is to facilitate discussions and to create space and help support country, but I don't feel that I don't have that power to make those decisions on cultural decisions. So that's just the diversity of how those kinship systems would work. But if I went to someone else's country and I went down to, say, Victoria, and I was working in a space, I wouldn't be able to make those decisions, or whilst I could give some sort of level of consultancy, I wouldn't be within my rights. And even within our systems, within our family groups, we have levels of knowledge and level of knowledge holders. And I think it's also mindful that that knowledge holder is not relevant to age. You could have someone that is at an elitist level of knowledge within that system who's 20 years old. And I think sometimes we get caught up in age as an indication of knowledge. And yes, there is definitely always a place for our old people and the wisdom that they bring and the roles and responsibilities that they have. But there's particular people that take down the path of a PhD in our cultural learning, and we need to respect that they've undertaken that as well. And they don't take that level of knowledge lightly. There's a whole lot of ceremonies and things that they need to uphold to get to that level. So I think it's only right that they be at the forefront of those discussions because they know way more about the landscape and the significance of an area too, because unfortunately a lot of the land has been cleared and a lot of spiritual and sacred areas, whilst they're not be something tangible, it's definitely got a spiritual and significance to the people. Hope that's answered it without going.
There's so much more. You're right. We might need to have part 2 of this conversation to carry out some more. There's a question from Chris Newton in the chat box. Chris, do you want to ask that yourself, or would you like me to read that for you? If I don't hear from you in 3 seconds, I'll carry on. Yep. I thought you would.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. So Kayeleen, if you're able to tell us a bit more about this. You mentioned in your introduction about women's roles, specifically in cultural burning, and I think you talked about women holding the cool fire in their hands. If you're able to tell us, that would be great. Thank you.
So that's just their general burning that they would be doing with just to clear the land. So they would be carrying the fire within their hands, and they would just, can't even describe it, but it's like a lawn mowing process. Without having to do a lawn mower, you'd be able to hand it. But we were never scared of fire. We were always aware that it was there. We never used more than what we needed, and it was never out of control. We never needed water. We would always walk on the fire. It would always be a part of everyday practice and learning. And it's really sad to see that my children, that the next generation growing up, aren't afforded that opportunity, and that they're bubble wrapped in a sense that fire is bad, and that we really protect them from fire, and then they don't develop those skill sets to really manage it. So when we go into the space of actual proper burns, there's particular spaces and ways that those burns need to occur with women. I'm happy to have a separate conversation offline with you about that, because I'm mindful that there's men in the room as well. But we do, there's levels of sacredness that obviously I can't talk about. I'm also mindful that I only speak for my bloodline as well. So, but there is particular things that are done particular ways, and some of our older women haven't been empowered to fulfill those cultural responsibilities as well, which can be quite traumatizing for them as well, to see as older women now areas of country that they went to as children that they can't access anymore because it's just overrun with lantana or whatever's, in the way that's not being burnt or back burnt for a really long time. Hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Wow, so much more. There's a question here from CW70. I can't think of who that is. Do you want to speak, CW70, or would you like me to read that out for you? I'll read it out because I can't see the mute coming off. We have, I know Vanessa, you've commented on this as well. We have project firefighter positions in Victoria, some of which are designated for Aboriginal people, but Aboriginal women rarely apply. Firefighting can be a physical job, and there is a fitness test that may put people off. A manual driver's license is also a barrier. How could we get more women to apply? Love that question. Thanks, CW70.
Oh, okay. Well, I think, is it down in Victoria, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
So, like I said, I'd be a bit out of place to speak on their behalf. I don't know what the capacity or the dynamics of the community, but I think when those things happen, when you're recruiting and you're not getting the uptake, there's a whole level of self-reflection that needs to take place around what were the barriers, why weren't people feeling that they could apply, and really stripping back the requirements. Like, is it really essential that they need to have this particular element, or is there a transition program that can help them get to that point? How are we instilling the motivation within community So what's the lead up to that recruitment? And that's what I'm trying to do at the moment around bringing the SES and fire and emergency management, starting to have those conversations with community at grassroots so they can motivate and start to create that as a dream for themselves. People might feel overwhelmed seeing that position and not understanding, what the requirements are. Is there a training regime to help them get to that fitness level? Or working in partnership with the AMS or other Aboriginal services that have fitness programs and funding for Close the Gap to get people fit. It's trying to look outside the box of what your outcome is and trying to work in partnership within the community sector with services that are available. It can be challenging, but if you do it the right way, you can really get the greatest uptake, and that's a reflection will be you'll start to be an employer of choice, and you won't need to promote anyone because one thing's for sure, the Aboriginal grapevine is very, very strong. So if you can get some good promotion and some good advocates, they'll be the greatest advertisers for you.
We're going to have to share your details because I'm really keen to know how you go with those conversations and at that grassroots level. So it would be really good to see how you go with that. And I'm, as a lot of you who know me know, I'm all about sharing good ideas, knowledge and wisdom so we can learn from each other and not just have, a great pocket of magic in one place and not share it with others as appropriate. So it'd be really good to keep in touch with you about how you go with that. And Vanessa, thank you. Vanessa's also made a comment, some suggestions as well back to CW70 around promoting female Aboriginal firefighters as well. So perhaps before I say thank you, I want to ask a question which has been on my mind since we met, and that is, can I put my name down to attend a Indigenous women-led cultural burn near me when I'm allowed to travel again? And am I allowed to go?
Oh yes, we can make the space. So there's definitely a range of Aboriginal-led fire groups, which Nicole has to my handy assistant on the left here, can put them in the chat box. But I'm just really mindful that, just have those conversations, start the genuine discussions and empower those women to have a voice and to be part of that discussion. Sometimes they're a bit hidden in community. And they don't have a whole lot of role models that are, like how many Aboriginal firefighter women do you know in Australia? And even when they are, have they been supported? Have they been empowered? Have they had a role in decision making? Women in general. So we can change that narrative, we can change that dialogue, but it starts with the people in this room, it starts at home, it starts at how you embed those perspectives in the way that you shape your children, the way that you shape those discussions that, Aboriginal women are valued and that they are a valued role within emergency management and fire management. And just in your discussions, if you're coming to a meeting and there's all men there, and why isn't there space for a woman? Or, we're having a Aboriginal fire discussion and Aboriginal men are talking and there's no space for Aboriginal women. Well, we need to stop that meeting and ask that be part of the consultation process. It's not very hard. It's something that we can start. And, if everybody's talking about it, and hopefully now because of the Royal Commission, people are starting to want to see the change. I think we're all agree we're pretty tired and exhausted of the status of the environment, and we really want to see that change. So I think that's a really great time to start that dialogue, start working in partnership, start to have those conversations. And like I said, Nicole's left an email. You can get in contact with me after this if there's people that want some further support to see where they're going on that journey. YWCA can help facilitate those discussions as well around women in land management. But yes, definitely, Amanda, we'll organise one if you can write the prescribed burn plan.
Okay, fine. It's going to be really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool because that is our biggest barrier because, you know, like you probably know, to get a fire crew out and to, you know, get those Aboriginal women, they don't have the Western qualifications, but they're keen, but, you know, to get them to that point. And I think, especially in the women's fire burn place, we need to have women-led fire crews, because that's the only culturally appropriate way to burn women's country in the future, is that we need to stop having to negotiate with predominantly non-Indigenous men to let us into our women's country to burn.
Well, where I live, I've got 1.5 acres of land that could do with a good burn, so maybe I'll see what I can organise, get some women around and have a bit of a party, a cool party.
Yes, that would be so nice.
I've thought about it a lot, but you've actually inspired me, and I know I have to stop now, but I could go on. And I've been so privileged to have you sort of to myself for the last hour, and I've taken up the time, and maybe you all had other questions as well. So thanks for indulging me and letting me ask a lot of my questions of Kayeleen, and for others that jumped in as well. I have been totally fascinated and enthralled and inspired, and I've got so many ideas about, you know, you touched on so many points. It was more than just Indigenous and cultural burning, but the role of women and our spirit, and you know, women firefighters, and how we create the time and space to celebrate what women bring. And that's what the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network is all about. And I'm wondering whether we can continue the conversation and see how the network can support some of the things that you're doing. And I think that we can create the space within the network to build something on the side or embedded within the network that can be a real advocate for the work that you're doing. And wouldn't it be great to see our Indigenous members, Women in Emergency Network members, gather and meet and be together in some way as well? That would be fabulous, I think. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Nicole, for introducing me to Kayeleen. I'm really looking forward to coming up and visiting you at some stage soon. I have taken a copy of all of the chat, and if there are any questions in there that we didn't get around to answering, Kayeleen, I'll share them all with you, and if there's anything that we can add, I'll send a follow-up email around to all members with the recording and also with a summary of the conversation and the chat. And if there's anything, Kayeleen, that you wanted to add, we can put that there as well. So I'm delighted that we were able to have this conversation. You're fabulous, Kayeleen.
So,
I'm a huge fan. Go, Nicole.
Sorry. Just before we end, Catherine has asked a question. She was a bit late to the conversation, but we can certainly take this offline. It's just in regards to how farmers in New South Wales would go about getting a women's cultural burn occurring.
Yeah.
And is there aspects around carbon credits? So I just wanted to acknowledge Catherine in regards to that question, and we can certainly take that offline, Catherine, and get back to you. So if you want to just send us through your details, maybe through Amanda, and then we can get back in contact with you in regards to that.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks all for the comments. Look, we'll see what feedback comes back, and if there is a follow-up conversation that we can have in a forum in the conversation series or separately, then let's see what we can organise. But I could certainly continue for ages, and maybe we can meet together face to face and have the conversation next time. I'd love to. So thank you all for joining. It's been great to see those of you that I can see. And once again, Kayeleen, thank you so much for sharing. You were very generous with your time and your knowledge, and I'm looking forward to our next chat. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you again. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kayeleen. How are you going?
It's
really good.
That was nerve-wracking.
Oh my goodness gracious! You know,
I was trying to. I think because the chat was up, and then I didn't. I was like, don't read it because I get distracted a little bit.
I am just so blown away by just how much came out of that conversation and what you covered. Thank you. I've really got lots of ideas now, and I have got some land here that I want to burn it, and I'm just wondering. And there's a woman here that does some of the burning here in the park, but also on private land. She's not an Indigenous woman, but she's a woman. And I wonder whether I can have a chat with her and just see what we can mobilise to see if we can have a cultural burn on women's land here. See what that would look like. I've got no idea whether it's practical or not, but it's great. I think that I just had a quick look at the comments, and I think you've inspired a whole new generation of women to see how they can support and contribute and play a role. So we won't let the conversation stop. We'll keep following it up. Perhaps we can have some regular updates in the newsletter once a month, you know, how you're tracking, or some good stories and articles on Indigenous women's role in Indigenous and cultural burning, just to keep the conversation going. There's space, yeah.
And what we were discussing just before getting on to this, Amanda, was the potential for having a panel of different Aboriginal women across different lands. And then we can certainly look at some sort of question and answer series in regards to looking at the differences between the different lands and how things would be undertaken differently.
That's a great idea. And one of the things about not being able to travel is that panels are really easy to pull together because they're sort of free. You don't have to travel. And whilst it's not the same not being together, it's something that we can organise in a lockdown environment or a limited travel. I think the state borders are getting bigger, not smaller. So the thought of us travelling, and particularly for people that live in Victoria, I can't even go home to South Australia, for goodness sakes. Anyway, I can see
you'll
that
be able to at Christmas, hopefully.
Oh,
Fingers crossed.
I think Victorians won't be allowed anywhere for years. I mean, we're so disgraced. But I can see that Ali's jumped on. She said she was going to come at 6, and you missed something fabulous, Ali. But we did record it, and I should stop the recording now. No, she's going to stay on mute.